Most women never truly grasp what burns behind a man's silence. What would you think if I told you that his most obsessive desires aren't loud, visible, or spoken, but buried beneath layers of pride, fear, and archetypal longing? A man will rarely confess what he truly aches for, not because he is incapable of words, but because even he doesn't always recognize what drives his hunger. His ego tells him its power. His shadow whispers its freedom. But deep within, beyond the personas he wears and the logic he clings to, are ancient cravings shaped by unconscious forces, feminine forces. Carl Jung understood the unseen forces that animate a man, the anima, the unlived feminine within him calling to be met. Not just in himself, but in the external woman who embodies what he lacks, represses, or projects. And here lies the paradox. The very thing he craves most, he fears surrendering to. The modern man may appear evolved, polished, articulate, accomplished. Yet beneath the exterior lies a boy exiled from his emotional self, terrified of need, yet aching to be unraveled by something or someone real. Not passive affection, not surface beauty, but a certain energy. An energy that disarms without asking, a presence that confronts him without aggression, a woman who mirrors not just his desire but his vulnerability and still does not flinch. She is not the perfect woman, she is the real woman. And it is her essence, not her obedience, that he obsesses over in the shadows of his psyche. You've seen it, you may have even felt it. The shift when you withdraw your need to be chosen, and suddenly he cannot look away. The silence you hold that forces him to hear his own thoughts. The calm strength with which you walk away, not to manipulate, but because your soul demands self-honoring. And it drives him mad. Men crave what they cannot control, but not in the way the world imagines. What truly obsesses him is the woman who reveals to him his own chaos and doesn't rescue him from it. The woman who sees past his masks and makes no demand that he be more than he is. And yet, in her presence, he feels the pressure to evolve. The first thing a man craves but will never admit is a mirror. Not a literal reflection, but a psychic one, the kind only a conscious woman can offer. Not approval, not praise, but truth, soft, unforgiving, sacred. The mirror that reveals the falseness of his persona, the gap between the role he plays and the man he could become. And yet the mirror cannot be forced into his hands. It must be held lightly, offered with stillness, otherwise it shatters. So many women misunderstand this dynamic. They give too much. They try to fix, to guide, to love him into clarity. But that is not the sacred feminine. That is the mothering wound replayed. And no man becomes obsessed with a woman who rescues him. He becomes obsessed with the woman who holds her boundaries like a queen, loves without losing herself, and disappears the moment he begins to betray her soul. This is not coldness. It is depth. It is a deep spiritual elegance that confuses him at first. She does not chase. She chooses. And in doing so, she ignites in him a hunger that has no name. The second thing a man craves but cannot say is spiritual safety. Not the kind built on predictability, but the sacred kind. The kind where he can unravel without being judged. Where his rage, his shame, his confusion are not punished, but understood as part of his shadow. And in that understanding he feels held, not caged. But such safety only arises when the woman has done her own shadow work, when she does not react to his emotional weather, but witnesses it. Detached, compassionate, grounded. This space is intoxicating to a man who has only ever known performance. To be seen in his rawness and still be desired, that is alchemy. Yet he will not tell you this. He may even push you away, test your silence, retreat into his mind. But that does not mean he does not crave you. It means he is frightened by how seen he feels, frightened by how little control he has in your presence, frightened that you are not addicted to him, but rather to your own truth. The third craving, deeper still, is for a woman who can destroy his illusions. Not with cruelty, but with her refusal to play small. Her refusal to contort, shrink, or perform for his comfort. This woman terrifies him, not because she is cruel, but because she is sovereign. She does not need him. And that is why he cannot stop needing her. In a world where most people are taught to play roles, to seduce, to perform, to please, a woman who dares to be fully herself is a spiritual jolt to the masculine psyche. She triggers not only desire, but awakening. And awakening hurts. Many men will run from this kind of woman at first. They will retreat into other women, simpler dynamics, easier egos. But she stays in their unconscious like a haunting. Not because she was perfect, but because she am. A de them feel. And what obsesses a man more than anything is the feeling he cannot recreate. There is something quietly catastrophic about a woman who knows herself. Not in arrogance, not in superiority, but in that bone-deep certainty that she does not exist to be interpreted, only witnessed. The fourth thing a man craves, though he may deny it with every muscle of his ego, is the inexplicable. The quality in a woman he cannot pin down, predict, or possess. The more he tries to understand her, the more she slips between the cracks of his logic. She is not chaos, she is the mystery beyond his intellect. And the masculine mind, for all its control, becomes obsessed with that which it cannot contain. Carl Jung spoke of the anima, the inner feminine that lives inside every man. When a man is unconscious of this force, he projects it outward, onto women, onto beauty, onto desire. He thinks he wants her body, her attention, her affection. But what he's truly seeking is union with the feminine within himself. The woman who evokes this inner anima, not through seduction, but through presence, becomes a psychological key. She awakens feelings he has buried, softness he has shamed, longing he cannot explain. And he becomes magnetized to her, not because she gives him something, but because she awakens something he has long exiled. But here lies the tension. He wants her, but he also resents needing her. Because to need her is to confront the parts of himself he's been taught to suppress. Vulnerability, surrender, feeling. So he distances, detaches, plays cold. Not because he doesn't crave her, but because he does, too much. And in craving her, he feels the crumbling of his illusion of control. It's in this space where his ego cracks that obsession is born. The fifth thing a man secretly craves is contrast. The contrast between his hardness and her softness, his logic and her intuition, his linear mind and her wild, cyclical wisdom. This contrast does not mean submission. It does not mean pleasing or dimming yourself. It means being what he is not, holding your ground in your feminine essence, rather than becoming a mirror of his energy. Most women have forgotten the power of contrast. They've learned to survive by becoming efficient, logical, emotionally numbed, mirroring the masculine world just to feel safe. But that very mimicry is what kills attraction. It's the polarity, the energetic dance of opposites that creates obsession. He craves the woman who doesn't compete with his dominance, but renders it unnecessary. Because in her presence, he remembers his softness. He finds rest, not because she is easy, but because she is true. And the truth, The truth is what his soul has been starving for. But not every man can withstand this kind of nourishment, because it requires him to shed his armor, to unlearn his numbness, to feel the ache of every moment he has abandoned his heart. This is why he won't admit what he craves, because to name it is to risk being shattered by it. And yet he watches her, the woman who does not explain herself, who doesn't try to be liked but cannot be forgotten. She becomes the story he rewrites in his head, the name he doesn't speak out loud, the presence that lingers long after she's gone. The sixth thing a man obsessively craves, but rarely names, is a woman who walks away without warning. Not out of malice, not as a game, but because her soul recognizes the moment her presence is no longer respected. She doesn't announce it. She doesn't beg. She doesn't try to make him see her worth. She simply leaves. And in that quiet departure, she delivers the most devastating mirror of all. That she was whole before him, and she will be whole after. Nothing unsettles a man more than realizing he was not the source of her identity. That her love was not dependency, but a gift. And that he has just lost access to a realm of depth he may never find again. He may try to replace her, distract himself, move on quickly, loudly, publicly. But the feminine mystery does not die easily, especially not the kind that moved his inner world more than his outer one. In that stillness, in her absence, he meets the seventh craving, the one that changes him. He craves a woman who no longer needs to be understood to be powerful. The woman whose power lies in her silence, her detachment, her presence that exists whether he sees it or not. She does not beg to be chosen. She is the chooser. And this flips his internal world upside down. This is not manipulation. This is initiation. The woman who owns her worth becomes a portal. She either awakens a man or terrifies him into deeper sleep. And that is her beauty. She does not force the outcome. She knows that what is meant for her cannot be chased. It must arrive ready, whole, unshaken by her fire. There is something almost mythic about a man who meets a woman rooted so deeply in her own soul that even his most calculated moves dissolve in her pee. Resents, not because she resists, but because she doesn't react. She sees, she feels, she discerns, but she does not betray herself for closeness. This disarms him more than rage ever could. Jung taught us that what we do not bring to consciousness will appear in our lives as fate. And this is precisely what happens to the man caught in obsession, not with the woman herself, but with the reflection of his unlived self that she stirs. She becomes his fate, his mirror, his initiation. But here's the paradox that few understand. It is not the woman's affection that binds him. It is her absence of need. The fact that she can love him without losing herself and leave him without closure. A man craves this level of detachment more than he knows. Not because he desires pain, but because he yearns for something real enough to rupture him. Something honest enough to shake his illusions. Something feminine enough to make him feel again. And she becomes unforgettable not because of what she gave, but because of what she refused to give once it cost her inner peace. This kind of woman doesn't punish. She doesn't explain her silence. She simply moves in alignment with a deeper compass. And that compass is what he cannot buy, predict, or replace. It is this compass, her unwavering inner orientation, that shows him what he lacks. A center, a spine, a soul not ruled by approval or attention. When she leaves, she does not do so to teach him a lesson. She does not script the role of the wounded woman, hoping he'll return and rewrite her story. She departs like the tide, inevitable, quiet, permanent. And he becomes haunted. Haunted not by the woman herself, but by the version of himself she made him see, the version he failed to rise into. He'll revisit the way she looked at him without needing him. He'll remember the way she touched him without losing herself. And he'll recall how, even in her silence, she said more than any woman ever had. This is the deep feminine, not the wounded feminine that clings or convinces, but the integrated one that knows. And her knowing becomes his mirror, his ache, his compass toward individuation if he's willing. Because here's the truth buried beneath the male psyche. A man does not become whole until he confronts the feminine. Not in her body, but in his soul. And the woman who has done her own shadow work, who no longer pleads, performs, or proves, becomes the doorway to that confrontation. She evokes his buried softness, his exiled grief, his sacred rage. She stirs the parts of him that have never been named. And once awakened, these parts do not return to sleep easily. She may be gone from his life, but she remains in his psyche. As myth, as memory, as mirror. He may attempt to find her again, in bodies, in glances, in moments that mimic her magic. But the feminine soul cannot be copied, because it was never about her lips, her words, her scent. It was about what she reflected back to him, his unlived depth, his forsaken sensitivity, his spiritual hunger. And so his craving becomes existential. Not for her, but for what he became in her presence. She becomes a symbol of all he lost by staying safe, by hiding behind intellect, by dismissing the divine. And in this realization, he is faced with a choice. To continue numbing, chasing surface pleasures, denying the call, or to begin the descent, the shadow work, the death of the false self. Because only through that descent will he ever touch the kind of love that does not burn out, but burns through. This is the sacred wound, the feminine wound in the male psyche that longs to be met, seen, dissolved. And only a woman who has stopped chasing can offer that kind of fire, because she is no longer playing the game. She has stepped off the stage, and in doing so, she has become real. Real enough to unmake him. Real enough to call forth the man buried beneath the boy. Real enough to either awaken or destroy. This is what he craves. This is what he fears. And this is what will live in his unconscious, long after names are forgotten. There is a moment, subtle, irreversible, when a man realizes she is no longer looking back. No more checking her phone, no more tracing the past, no more wondering what if. And in that moment, something ancient collapses within him. Not just the hope of rekindling her affection, but the quiet recognition that she has returned to herself completely, to the stillness that existed before he ever arrived. This is the silent reckoning that men rarely speak of, the sacred aftermath of being in the presence of a woman who no longer needs to prove her worth, not even to herself. He cannot name the emptiness because it has no name. He only knows something wholly slipped through his fingers. And now the silence echoes louder than her words ever did. Jung once said that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But for a man, the deeper terror is often to see himself through the eyes of a conscious woman, because she does not worship his mask. She sees past the armor, into the places he has never let himself visit. And he becomes addicted to that gaze. Not because it flatters him, but because it reveals him. And even when she's gone, he will search for that reflection. In the curves of strangers, in the echoes of memories. But it won't be there. Because she did not give him something external. She called out something internal. This is the feminine at its most powerful, when it evokes not dependency, but awakening. But not all men will rise. Some will resent the pull. They will label her cold, too intense, too complicated. They will try to reduce her to something palatable, something small enough to forget. But obsession never clings to the easy. It lingers in the mystery, the contrast, the departure. What he truly craves is not just the woman, but who he was becoming in her presence. And that transformation, once begun, cannot be undone. You see, a man's craving is not physical. That is the surface layer, the illusion. His true longing lies in being pierced by a force that makes him remember he has a soul. A force that makes him feel again. Not just pleasure, but ache, stillness, surrender. She becomes that force not because she chases his attention, but because she stops chasing altogether. And in doing so, she becomes sovereign. It is sovereignty, not seduction, that drives him mad. The realization that her world does not orbit around him. That her beauty is not a performance for male validation. That her silence is not punishment, but protection. She does not manipulate. She magnetizes, not through effort but essence. And the man who is ready, truly ready, will not try to contain her. He will not beg her to dim. He will rise. But many will not. They will attempt to possess what cannot be owned. They will cling to ghosts. And in doing so, they will betray themselves again. Because the woman who awakens a man is not waiting for his arrival. She is not frozen in time, hoping he becomes worthy. She is in motion, always evolving, always choosing herself. And that is what he craves most. A woman who exists beyond his grasp, not out of cruelty, but because her worth is not up for debate. The final truth he cannot admit. That he wants her more the moment she no longer waits. That the version of her who has outgrown him is more intoxicating than the one who once adored him. But he has lost access. Not because she punished him, but because she healed. And the healed woman is no longer addicted to potential. She no longer invests in half-love or empty promises. She no longer holds space for what drains her light. He craves the woman she was, but obsesses over the woman she became without him. This is not a tragedy. This is evolution. He may return. He may apologize. He may say the right words. But the woman who has done the inner work will no longer be moved by apologies dressed in old patterns. She sees the truth now, not just in him but in herself. And so she lets go, not out of bitterness, but because she has finally remembered. She was never here to be wanted. She was here to be. And in simply being, she became everything he craved, but could not hold. There is a sacred grief that comes with awakening, not loud, not violent, but quietly shattering. It doesn't roar. It lingers. In the spaces he once filled. In the silences she once tolerated. In the truths she finally stopped denying. A woman doesn't become untouchable overnight. It happens slowly. in the ache of staying too long, in the humiliation of being almost seen, in the emptiness of loving a man who only loved her in theory. And when she finally withdraws, not out of anger but clarity, a different kind of fire is lit in him. Not passion, not romance, but the unmistakable sting of recognition. She's gone. Not physically, perhaps, but psychically. Gone in the way that matters most, from the emotional tether that once gave him power. He craves her most when she becomes inaccessible. Not blocked, not hidden, not vindictive, but unavailable at a soul level. Because she has transcended the dynamic. She no longer plays the role he needed her to play. She no longer reflects the wounded boy back to him. She reflects only herself. And in that wholeness, he sees the emptiness of every game he played. Every text he didn't send. Every vulnerability he buried beneath sarcasm or silence. The obsession grows not from what she did, but from what she stopped doing. She stopped waiting. Stopped giving him the power to define her worth. Stopped bleeding for love that would never water her roots. In that detachment, she becomes mythic. Not because she is flawless, but because she is free. And freedom is the one thing the unawakened man cannot offer. Because he has not yet freed himself. Jung wrote that we are not what happened to us. We are what we choose to become. And so she becomes. No longer the reflection of his projections. No longer the salve for his abandonment wounds. No longer the mother he never grieved. She becomes woman. Sovereign. Self-contained. And in becoming woman, not caretaker, not rescuer, not fantasy, she becomes unforgettable. The feminine mystique has never been about seduction. It is about remembrance. The way she reminds him of something he forgot. That love is not performance. That connection is not control. That depth cannot be faked. But these are truths that demand confrontation. And many men, still ruled by the persona, by ego, pride, and fear of intimacy, will flee. Not because she is too much, but because she makes them feel too deeply. And feeling for the unintegrated masculine is a threat. But for the rare man who chooses the path of the soul, who chooses awakening over avoidance, depth over dominance, devotion over distraction, she becomes something else entirely. Not a fantasy, but a mirror for his transformation. Because the woman who has done her shadow work will never beg for love. She will never fight to be seen. She has become the one who sees herself. And in that vision, she holds a standard not for how others treat her, but for how she treats herself. A standard that rewrites everything. That turns attraction into reverence. That turns attention into presence. She is no longer impressed by surface power. She sees through the masks. She knows what a man says means little. It is who he is in stillness that speaks. And if he cannot meet her in that stillness, she will not chase. She will not explain. She will not shrink. Because the woman who has reclaimed her soul does not move from desperation. She moves from discernment. And it is this discernment that drives him mad. Not because it punishes him, but because it illuminates him. He cannot pretend around her. She doesn't fall for charm. She reads energy like scripture. And so he either rises or fades. And if he fades, he will spend lifetimes looking for the feeling she gave him. The feeling of being undressed by truth and still desired. The feeling of being seen in his wounds and not shamed. The feeling of being loved but not needed. Most women never know this power because they are still too busy trying to earn it. But she remembered. She stopped performing. She stopped begging. And in that return to herself, she became legend. Not the kind men brag about, but the kind they dream of. The kind they regret. The kind they write poems about in the quiet of the night when no one is watching. The woman who is no longer for the world, because she has finally become her own. There is a final silence that cannot be broken, not by apology, not by longing, not even by love. It is the silence of a woman who has reclaimed her name in the echo of every moment she abandoned herself for someone else. A silence that is not bitter but cleansed. She no longer needs to speak because her very being is the message. She is whole, and wholeness does not negotiate. What a man obsesses over in the end is not the version of her who was available, but the version who outgrew his absence. The version who, through pain and fire, chose herself. He remembers how she looked at him, not with hunger but with hope. And he remembers how, slowly, that hope dissolved into discernment, until it became silence. And then nothing. Not numbness. Not vengeance. But the sacred nothingness that follows true healing. He had her heart once, or something close to it. But he could not hold it. Not because he was cruel, but because he was not ready to be known. You see, a man can only hold what he has held within himself. And he had not yet touched his own soul, so how could he cradle hers? This is the final truth. A man cannot truly love a woman until he has met the woman within. His anima, his darkness, his vulnerability, his softness, and the woman he craves, the awakened, spiritually feminine woman, is not interested in the man who runs from that. She wants the man who can stand naked in front of the mirror and not flinch, who has confronted his shadow and found grace in it, who does not fear her depth because he has swum in his own. That is the man who obsesses differently. Not from lack, not from fear, but from reverence, because he sees her not as a conquest, but as a companion to the sacred unfolding, not as a savior, but as a sovereign. He doesn't crave her to complete him. He craves her because he is finally complete within himself. And from that wholeness, true obsession becomes devotion. Not the frantic hunger of the unhealed, but the focused presence of the awakened masculine. But this man is rare. And until he arrives, she does not wait. She does not sit in longing. She walks. She rises. She becomes. Her life is not a waiting room for someone else's readiness. Her love is not a reward for potential. Her softness is not a performance to be earned. She is. And in being, she remembers. She was never the storm. She was the eye. Still, powerful, unmoved by anything that does not match her peace. She is the fantasy made real, not through beauty or perfection, but through authenticity. And that authenticity will always live in his mind, not as punishment, but as possibility. The woman who loved him without needing him, who left without hate, who rose without blame. She is the ache in his soul, and the doorway to his growth, but only if he chooses to walk through it. Until then, she has already gone, not out of reach, but beyond resonance. Because a woman who knows her worth doesn't wait to be chosen. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.